program. And it's a pleasure to have so many of you with us today, in addition to the current students in the Arts and Education program. You know that it's traditional, common in introducing guest speakers to say that it's a special privilege to welcome our speaker today. But I do want to say that, and I really mean it. It is a very special privilege. If it weren't for our speaker today, I think it's fair to say that none of us would be sitting here at all. I wouldn't be in my role. The current students in the AIE program wouldn't be in the AIE program. The alumni wouldn't be the alumni. The advisory council wouldn't exist. Why? Because our speaker today, Jessica Davis, invented all of this. Before Jessica Davis, there was no AIE program at GSE, and now there is. So let me quickly tell a story. A long, long time ago, in a galaxy far away, well, actually in a couple of offices across the street in Longfellow Hall, Project Zero was housed at that time in the same rooms that the AIE program now fills. I was a researcher there, and Jessica was a senior researcher conducting numerous studies on community arts centers and on learning in art museums. And Jessica, at that point, began to develop the vision, or at some point, it may have been long before, but she had the vision, and more importantly, the nerve, to think that the Harvard Graduate School of Education would actually be a better place if it acknowledged the significant role of the arts in human development and human learning. From my perspective, that was a terrific and quite beautiful thought and wonderful nerve, and it took a great deal of nerve to see it from vision to reality. But it's easy to have the thought. Jessica had the commitment and the perseverance. So we thank her for that. Now, Jessica has taken many of the ideas that she has been working on for many years, and which she began to give some particular shape to during her years as director of the AIE program, and she's put it into a book. Today, she's going to talk to us about those ideas and that book called Framing Education as Art. The Octopus Has a Good Day. I've read it. I highly recommend it. It's a very serious exploration of the role of the arts in education and in society, and it is also a really wonderful read. Before she tells us, pardon? You're going to get this title a number of times today. Framing Art Education as Art. Let me also say that immediately after the lecture today, we'll have copies of the book on sale in the hallway just outside of this lecture room. Now, before Jessica tells us more about the book and her ideas, I'd like to share some more formal but no less important background material. Jessica Hoffmann Davis has worked as an arts practitioner, a teacher, researcher, and administrator. She founded and was director of the Arts and Education program here at the Graduate School of Education, where, as the Patricia Bauman and John Landrum Bryant Senior Lecturer, she held Harvard University's first chair in the arts and education. A cognitive developmental psychologist with an abiding interest in children's artistry and arts learning, Dr. Davis has studied and written extensively on the model and promise that the arts provide for pedagogy, assessment, and research. Her work developing the methodology of portraiture into a group process is addressed in her co-authored with Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot book, The Art and Science of Portraiture, and reflected in Passion and Industry, Schools That Focus on the Arts, a collection of portraits of Boston area arts-focused high schools. In multi-year national studies at Harvard Project Zero, Jessica explored the educational effectiveness of community arts centers in urban communities, and learner-centered encounters in art museums. This work is described in a series of monographs: Safe Havens, Another Safe Haven, The Wheel in Motion, the Co-Arts Assessment Plan from Theory to Action, and The Muse, Museums Uniting with Schools in Education book. Her latest book, from Teachers College Press, Framing Education and Art, builds on her persistent belief that one way or another, arts learning should be part of every child's every day at school. I'm pleased to introduce Jessica Davis.
Thank you very much. I thought for a minute, well, it's a much better title because The Octopus Has a Good Day really tells you what the book is about. And then I started thinking about it, and I realized that the octopus was a terrific metaphor for the sinewy arts that float in and out of education, in and out of the community. And so I decided actually to use his title, and I changed it to Framing Education as Art, The Octopus Has a Good Day. Of course, the irony is now the title is exactly as opaque as my original title, but my initial concern really was that this book, The Octopus Has a Good Day, would end up in the children's book section of any store. Just as Sarah's and my book, The Art and Science of Portraiture, is often, it's a book about methodology, a research methodology, and it often shows up in the painting sections of bookstores. I had no idea what would happen to this title. This is what it says on Amazon.com. If you find my book of interest, you may also want to read about wholesale frames and mats, or perhaps even octopus art. But I persevere, and I'm delighted that at least as many people who are in this room will know that this is a good title. One of my examples is that there are at least 8 ways that the arts enter American education. The first is arts-based, in those rare situations where we have schools where the arts are actually used as lenses for studying everything. Arts-infused, which could range from classrooms where a visiting artist comes in to enrich the day, or the teacher plays music or shows or film. Arts included, where the arts are included as subjects equal to other subjects in the school and given equal time and attention. Arts is expanded, where the arts take you out of school into cultural institutions and museums, and trust me, there are at least 8 of them. Arts professional, that's those schools in which we actually use the model of the professional artist as an outcome that's viable for students. Arts extra, sadly the most familiar, where arts are reserved for after-school hours. Aesthetic education, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, in which, after John Dewey and Maxine Greene, the arts are used for framing experience. My God, there are some alumni from way back. How are you? And arts cultura, which you have to read the book to find more about. It has a sort of a Vanna White wheel of culture that goes with it. But basically is a view of the arts as connective tissues that join a conversation over circumstance and time that perhaps begins with the worldview of the individual child going through neighborhoods, communities, intercultural understandings as we understand them, and back again to the culture of humankind. It's interesting when you start thinking about the number 8 and the tentacles. I'm sure you're familiar with Ellen Winter and Lois Hetland's new work on the studio thinking framework, 8 of them. I'm beginning to think the arts and education is an octopus. I'd like to tell you what's in the book. I hope it won't make you not want to read it. I hope you'll think, oh, that sounds interesting. But if you never read it, you'll actually have a great sense of what is in it. Scott thought I might read from the book, but as some of you alumni know, who remember me reading drafts when I was writing it, it was not a very popular activity, and I would see you going blank and sliding under your chair. So I will not read aloud too much. But I will tell you that the origins of the Octopus Has a Good Day are right here. And that is why it feels so exciting for me to bring this book home to you all today. It stems from the thinking that we've done for almost a decade in the Arts and Education program, from the great ideas and examples I've had from all the students over the year who advocate for the arts and education in so many different ways. From the core class that we developed for our time here, I know there is another one that you are all shaping moving forward in your great new chapter. That course, like this book, so if you are interested in a quick experience of it, there's another reason to read it, my big cigar, had an emphasis on inquiry, real questions, the kind that you don't know the answer to, that are harder to construct than you think, but seem to fuel quality work in art and in research. A notion of multiple perspectives, lots of different voices on similar topics. This notion of generative tensions, don't get upset, I'll explain it to you. And the notion of a process folio assignment. I have some pictures of process folio assignments. This was the idea after Betty Blayton Taylor, who was the head of the Children's Art Carnival in New York, of turning our thoughts into things and actually constructing something in response to ideas and concerns and questions. This book, for all of you in AIE, is my process folio entry. It's very much informed by the thinking and research of my colleagues here at the Ed School, and of course at Project Zero, where, as Steve told you, I spent an awful lot of time. And it's also informed by personal experience, lots of personal stories and reflection from what terrifyingly adds up to about a half a century on my part of thinking about children and art. The basic premise and purpose of this book is to reverse the dominant paradigm. The dominant paradigm in which the arts are seen as handmaidens to general education in search of a seat at the table, and instead approaching the arts and the challenges and triumphs they provide as models for all education. No more, but we can do that too, moving to a stance in which we say, excuse me, look what we do. Maybe you can do that too. Towards that end, I waste not a breath in this book on that famous music teacher who told us all not to sing but move our lips, or that unforgettable art teacher who tore up or wrote all over our first drawing. They're not in this telling of the story. This story is filled with bravado and self-congratulations for all of us who have struggled and worked in the arts. It never makes sense to me that it seems unusual to think of the arts as models for education. Throughout history, we have looked to the arts for making sense of all kinds of experience. Why not look to the arts for making sense of all kinds of education? And for those of you from the class of '99, what do you think of that slide? Pretty eclectic. We're changing the discourse from, and since this is a very familial presentation, I should let you know that these three-dimensional objects were created by the artist Faye Chandler, who I don't know if you've had the chance to meet, but has been a great supporter of our work in the arts and education. So we're changing the discourse from the best ways to package learning in and through the arts to make it fit in the arguably effective, tidy wrappings of insider mainstream subjects, to rewrapping mainstream subjects in the generous, messy-edged, charismatic, engaging packaging of those vibrant outsiders, the arts. I do this by walking the reader through a series of topics that are relevant to the arts and to the arts and education, and at each juncture selecting and considering a generative tension. This transparent definition is from the book. A false, though dueling dichotomy, a complex challenge, and or a key debate. These are questions and debates that are particularly associated with the field and with the issues that we consider. Generative tensions illuminate that dynamic space between either and or. Either and or are very useful ways to get into a discussion. But what's happening, I argue, what's interesting, I argue, happens in between. in a more truthful space that is so consistently the territory of the arts. Here, for example, and if I were to ask you all to make a list, I'm sure you would come up with others, are some examples associated with the arts of what I'm saying. Art is at the same time real as it is fictive. It is the same time complete, every work of art, and in another sense just beginning. Each work of art is unique and at the very same time universal. True and false about the artist, about you, about nothing, and about everything. Absolutely certain and completely changing every time you come back to it. Right and wrong. This is an important message for educators at this time. Right and wrong. Has anyone seen that movie, Cheaters? Did you see this movie about? It's a very controversial topic of this teacher who's working with a group of kids who are academically challenged and they want to win a competition. I won't tell you more about it, except there's a wonderful moment in which one of the teacher looks at one of the students' tests and he says, "What's going on here? You have 3 answers for every one of these questions." And he said, "Well, it was multiple choice." And I thought, that's really terrific. What about a test where, if you're really thinking, the more possibilities you could come up with and defend, the righter your answer? Useless and essential. I could go on, and I hope you're getting the point. Either pole of each dichotomy is useful, but without its alternative, incomplete. So generative tensions, I use them, and I hope, and I think they have been helpful to us over the years in situating our inquiry in the particularly nuanced territory of the arts. And in the end, as you will see, they provide the woodwork and the glass that is the structure and the lenses for framing general education as art. Okay, the generative tensions in the book chart a journey through 4 relevant topics. The first one is the artistic process. Please know that these are discussions, not definitive answers. We'd love to tell you in the first 7 pages we decide what is art. In the next 8 we consider how it is a when. But these are topics that are included, along with the characteristics of making and appreciating art, this dynamic between a producer and a perceiver and what happens in the work in between. The vexing notion of intention. Does it only count as art if you meant it to be art? Is the 5-year-old's drawing that makes you cry not really a successful drawing because the child didn't intend for it to be sad? And various reflections on expressivity. And the generative tension here is between thinking and feeling. I've selected these 2 models of the brain and the heart because I think they look so similar. Do you see what I mean? Well, at the right angle, highlighting certain features and dimming the lights on others. From the feeling side of this tension, we ask the question, and this is after Tolstoy's What is Art?, of whether art is really about communicating emotion. The tortured artist who has experienced pain pours his misery into the work of art, and you as the viewer re-experience that sorrow and through this piece. The going phrase would be, that painting makes me feel sad. Versus, and this is after the notion of Nelson Goodman, cognitive philosopher who is founder of Harvard Project Zero here, who helped us understand this idea of making art as a thinking, thoughtful process, the manipulation of aspects of representation, so that we consciously create a work that exemplifies the emotion, that is a metaphor for the emotion. Regardless of how we feel, I can be very happy this day, but I understand how to put symbols together in such a way that this will be what we could call a sad painting. So you see, this is a cognitive triumph instead of an emotive ouch. The co-constructing of meaning versus the sharing of emotion, and with it, the attendant thoughtful process of interpretation versus the somewhat pedestrian topic of communication. And all of this has very serious implications for our attitudes towards the arts, and whether they are processes of thought and perception worthy of academic attention, or really arenas for the expression and release of emotion better suited for time outside of school. I'm sure many of you have had first-hand experiences with your art classroom being just a little too noisy, just a little too passionate, just a little too active. What's it doing here in school? I am arguing all classrooms should have similar energy, and educators should be allowed to use that word that arts educators have been told for a long, long time we're not supposed to use, joyful. If I could really talk about what happens in my arts classroom, I hear this from educators all the time, I would say joyful. But it's really hard to measure that on the joyful scale. What is emotion without thought that fears, embraces, or represents it? And what is thought without feeling that humanizes, confounds, and directs it? The lines between thinking and feeling are more readily than clearly drawn. This piece of art, do you think it's a brain or a heart? How many people think it's a brain? How many people think it's a heart? How'd you know it was a brain? I suppose my understanding of science is so limited that it entitles me to these pure views. The next territory is that of the child as artist. And this includes the ways in which artists admire and may consciously seek to emulate the vision of the child artist, and that being a romantic side of the equation from the more rational side of the equation, the way in which cognitive psychologists and psychologists of the arts for years have studied actually what children do in the arts to make sense of development. And, of course, this is all set against a backdrop of our relative regard for artists in society as world movers or world forsakers. Those who make it happen throughout time and culture, or those who stand in the fringe, at the fringe, dressed all in black, skeptically reviewing the scene. From that, we have the image of Tonio Kruger. Many of you remember reading Tonio Kruger, standing on the edge of the dance, looking from outside in. We don't know as seriously or self-congratulatory, appreciating his painful outsiderdom. And of course, in most more postmodern perspectives, the vision of the artist as the outsider is completely passé. Here, and I don't think it matters which one was done by a 5-year-old child and which one was done by a professional artist, but both of these artists were asked to draw the emotion angry. And both of these artists made a terrible, terrible angry face, and with a very hard pencil tried to cover it all with scribbles. The 5-year-old, when she was finished, said to me, "There you go, that's angry. If I had a little more time, you wouldn't see anything showing through." Do we all romanticize? And do artists emulate the freewheeling, direct, connected, fluid, expressive rapport with young children that young children have with their art? Or is the study of child art with an eye to human development, replete as it is with loss and gain, and for education, replete as it is with loss and gain, a rational pursuit? You may not be familiar with the dreaded U, although I know a lot of you are, but in the notion of U-shaped development, we place and celebrate the young child's expressive drawings, this is a 4-year-old, on the high point of the U, balanced and in many ways similar, this is Miro, with the expressive triumphs of artists. And then we watch the use of expressivity through children over time, and sadly we find children at 8 to 11 years old, losing that flair, that sense of freedom and expressivity in their drawing, becoming, for example, more concerned with how many buttons and belt buckles than with the vision of the whole. And we see those children suffering the trough of the U, with some of them persisting and moving through as adolescents to the maturity of the adult artists, and many of them moving stage left, or in this case right, depending on whether you're you or me, and exiting, having that be the end of their development, changing the U to an L, perhaps, for literal. Children at this stage are often called at the literal stage. At any rate, those of you who are unfamiliar with this are probably correctly saying, well, it depends on what your standards are for expressivity and whether this is a modern ethic. There are many, many questions to be asked, and many folks who argue for the increase of repertoire of the children in middle childhood. They may be losing one kind of drawing, but they're learning something else about art. The truth is that by the age of 12, too many kids will tell you, I'm not an artist. I don't do art anymore, and know that it's not particularly going to matter to most of us. And so regardless of whether they've been gathering repertoire or losing expressivity, we do see the loss of an activity which is rampant among kids 3 to 5 years old. And I would argue that's true across artistic disciplines, from the role-playing in the pretend play corner in preschool, to the invention of music and song, to the wonderful flamboyant drawing that we see children throw themselves into. And of course, all of this has implications for our view of artists at the center, making a difference, viable role models for our children. Do we really want to see our children grow up to be like Tonio Kruger, languishing at the end of the dance, writing poetry where the beautiful blonde, blue-eyed folks are actually involved in the dance? Or outsiders, are they outsiders looking longingly like children who arguably through their play, through their creative endeavors, are trying to make sense of and to gain entrance into this adult world? And the way in which these values and these interests add up to our discounting the artistic proclivities, however you measure them, that young children bring to school. When we level the playing field between artist and child, between producer and perceiver, between meaning maker through image and meaning maker through words, we make real and tangible the conversation through art that artists and viewers of art have perpetuated across time and circumstance and culture. If we value this conversation in and of itself, we need to be sure that all our children, at every juncture in their development, have sufficient art instruction to learn and to use the vocabularies of art. The next terrain in our four-stop journey takes us to the arts and education in school. And this begins with a discussion of the history of art education in this country, a close look at different venues for the arts in school. We looked at the appropriate 8 version up front. And then the results of what we've learned from a study Steve mentioned, Passion and Industry, in which we actually looked at what was happening in schools that focus on the arts. Thank you. This means you can hear me, right? Thank you. Sorry, you can hear the gulp. In a discussion of the arts and education in school, we posit the generative tension between justification and celebration. The view I give of the history of art education in this country is one of a series of opening and slamming windows of opportunities. Those of you who have attended conferences for arts educators around the country will hear, there's a window of opportunity for us this year. There's an interest in leadership. Or there was the scans report. There's an interest in responsibility. We can do that. We can do this. It goes all the way back to the industrial era, where the arts were going to prepare us for having technical skills so that we could help make marketable goods. To the flourishing of the arts in the progressive era, where we had a vision of the whole child and a great sense of creativity. To the cognitive revolution, when we started defending the arts as modes of thought and critical thinking, and out of which emerged discipline-based art education. And actually here on the home front, arts propel reflection, perception, and production. This notion of metacognition, thinking about thinking. The arts can do everything. Even now in this test-crazed world, although it's being contested at every stop, they can bring your grades up in subjects that really matter and help you to do better on your tests. And that's actually, I'm sure you've read, once again, Ellen and Lois's work, challenging the notion of there being a causal link between the arts raising your SAT scores. Also challenging the notion that that's even an interesting question. But the truth is that we have found that across all economic stratas and backgrounds, kids who study the arts do better on the SATs. In fact, the longer they study the arts, the better they seem to do. What we can't prove, which Ellen and Lois have helped us see, is that there's a causal link. It may just be that they go to better schools, and better schools have arts. You'd think there'd be a lesson in that, but they're maybe getting better instruction across the board. Whatever the window of opportunity, we leap out it. And the arts, being as synthetic and flexible and the malleable octopus that we know it to be, can fit into every slit in the window. And this is a joyful coincidence that in our passion and industry study, we came up with 8 features. You know, there's that study from the 50s by George Miller, The Magic Number 7. It says most of us can remember 7 numbers. How many numbers are in a phone number? Well, there used to be 7. Now we all have to be a bit more advanced to do the area code. And really gifted people can remember 8, but the magic number is around 7 for what our memory can hold easily, short-term memory. At any rate, when we studied closely schools that focus on the arts and tried to find characteristics of what it looks like in places where the arts are not being defended every day, where they're not having to be advocated for every single day, what does it look like? What are the qualities that seem attendant to those contexts for education? We found that there was a tremendous respect for difference, from different points of view looking into subjects, to difference among students who felt estranged and outside of other schools felt at home there. They were encouraged to be different. We found an enormous and just frequently cited sense of passion. I'm passionate about what I'm doing here. The kids won't go home at the end of the day. And I know we do more. We do more because we have arts and academics. So there was a high sense of industry. This is harder. Serious study in the arts is hard work. We had a sense of the community outside, from the immediate community of the school to the community of artists represented in local museums or the internet. There was a great sense of connection. And probably at the center of it all, this notion of process and ongoing reflection on process. It's all a process here. We heard it over and over again. Of course, this has implications for whether there really are safe spaces for the arts in schools. Because one of the first things we learned is that even in these schools that focus on the arts educators are advocating for their disciplines. Whether it's to the funders who will support their work, or the non-arts teachers who doubt it, or trying to find a way to coordinate, folks always seem to feel that they need to defend what they're doing in the arts. And as you will see, I actually question whether that's such a bad thing. What if all subjects had to defend themselves in such a similar way? Why is what I'm doing in math relevant? We're thinking of getting rid of it this year. Is there some way you can Tell me why it fits with our current priorities and objectives. How much science do we need to know to go on with what's happening in the national scene? Because if it's irrelevant, and hey, if it's not raising my children's expressivity in music, out. What would happen? But of course, the most important thing is to see what can happen and thrive in those places, because maybe they do and can happen in other schools. From the perspective of justifications, we see the arts being contained and repackaged in whatever is the latest, greatest reform movement in general education. From the perspective of celebration, we see the arts being opened up as alternatives for learning in schools and their communities. In the justification scenario, bless you, the arts are at the door, struggling to come in. In the celebration scenario, the arts are more safely situated within, opening the windows and doors for everyone in the learning community. In these arts-focused schools, they said the best advocacy is to get folks in here. Just let them do what we're doing. We had a math teacher, someone told us at a charter art school, who was going to go and teach, start another charter school, no arts. We gave him the lead in West Side Story, and he was fabulous. And guess what? The last terrain which we travel in our octopusial journey, I'm actually not sure of that word, crustaceous journey, is the arts and education in the community. We look beyond school walls to take a look at art museums, those venerable centers of object conservation, and the other most well-known struggling alternative community art centers known to all of us as outposts of youth cultivation. Caleb Nealon, 04, his work in the community outside of the revolving museum. In the community, I posit a tension between these sites, the Mighty Muse and the Safe Haven. Those are actually titles of the two works Steve referred to. The Muse study, Museums Uniting with Schools and Education, was our first understanding of how powerful an acronym can be. I don't know if you know this, but when you start a project, you begin with the acronym and then make the words fit. Did you know that? Because that project was originally called Museums and Schools as Partners in Learning, for which the acronym was MASSAPIL, which my research assistant said sounds like an ointment, or can't do it. So someone came and called it Muse. And Safe Haven, which is actually an expression that we lifted from the voices of constituents at these places who continuously referred to the sites as safe havens. And so we take a look at the Mighty Muse, the American Art Museum, started in this country, when we were beginning to get over our sense of inferiority, or hoping to get over our sense of inferiority to the Europeans, and creating our, Professor Ackerman, you can correct me if I have any of this wrong. This is James Ackerman on our board. John and Stuart, these are folks in the background who have helped to make your program thrive. Jim is a famous art historian, so I'm saying that the American Art Museum, and most of them, would you say that the many of them were based after the Victoria and Albert in London? Thank you. And sort of our trying to recreate this European sense of high culture. And the truth is that the place of education in these venerable halls is still a question of debate. Are they a priori about education because of the conservation of these important objects? Or should there be, and we know more and more there are, programs around museum education, ways within the museums to educate viewers and to help them learn about what it is to go to a museum and make sense of art. James Cuno, who was formerly the head of the FOG and is now at the Art Institute in Chicago, in a very controversial and interesting article called The Mission of the University Art Museum, suggested that it was a failing of American schools that museums had to take up the responsibility for educating kids to make sense of what happens in the art museum. I don't know how you feel about it, but it's an interesting idea that perhaps that should be part of what you learn in school. So you know how to come into the art museum, and they can take it from there. Within these hallowed walls, there is still a lively debate between question, inquiry, building on what the viewer knows, the kind of work that Abigail Housen and Philip Yetterwein do, asking you, what do you see? What does it remind you about from your own lives? Giving you the sense that you, as a viewer, know enough, even though you come into this treasure trove of art history, to make sense of what you see. And information. Do we have time to ask you those questions? Or shall we share with you some of the rich art historical knowledge that we can pour into the empty vessel that you are? I'm being facetious. On the other side, and equally in the community, are these community art centers. And we looked at community art centers in urban neighborhoods that featured education, that were dedicated to education. So these aren't galleries that have weekend artists coming in. These are places that have sustained and sequential educational programs. We looked over time at what their purposes were, the ways they kept track of what they did, and the example that they provided, since most of them are run by artists, of artists creating education beyond the constraints of school. And all of this has implications for whether these community-based arts educational sites offer alternative opportunities for student learning or essential activities that should regularly be incorporated into the student's life at school. And of course, here again, it's a look beyond the constraints of what the arts and education, when they are allowed to flower, do. One might say that as important as the object is to the mighty muse, the young person is to the community arts center. The highest ranked goals, people here have worked on that project, were personal and interpersonal goals, making art to gain life skills, seeing yourself as an artist, having a sense of identity and a powerful sense of voice. That's the Art Museum in Minnesota on the right or left. Oops. Where community art centers provide durable, safe oases, art museums may seem forbidding and monolithic. Where museums house great works of art that stand the test of time and human attention, community art centers are in themselves vibrant works of art, actively engaged in, rather than physically representing, the possibilities for social reconciliation. The alternative experiences that both settings provide hold great promise for mutual enrichment, and at this moment, the boundaries between museums and community as we have known them are being traversed and renegotiated. It is exciting to see what art museums are stepping forward to do in the community, and with community art centers as well. Such exchange, determination, and redetermination of meaning are reminiscent of the ever-changing dialogue between the producer and the perceiver of a work of art. So now we've gone through these four territories, and perhaps we're showing another face of that poor sensual, sentient creature, the weary octopus. A thinking and feeling strand, our community art centers about arts and emotion and personal support and social reconciliation, and our art museums about art historical knowledge and interpretation and more clearly intellectual activities. Or are they once again quite blurry in terms of their separate spaces? All of it, and hopefully the distance we've gone, all has implications for how we view the arts in school, giving us different ways to think of whether we value them or not. So we began with works of art and their making. Then we've taken a look at artists as children. Then we go to school and the education of the child artist. And then we go beyond school walls. And all along the way, we've been collecting, as I promised, the woodwork, the wholesale mats, the lenses, the frames, for framing general education as art. And in this last section of my talk. I'll go quite quickly because I really hope we have time for questions. You said 2:24. I urge you to think of the questions that I am suggesting as examples of the lens of the arts being turned on general educations, not only as examples of ones you can find in this book, but perhaps of examples of ones you can come up with yourself. Because my great hope in this work is that this is part of a conversation and that my reader will jump right in. What happens when we consider mainstream education in terms of the artistic process, thinking, feeling? What questions might artful? Bienvenido. And I use the term artful for artful educators as they might exist, and of course the many, many artful educators who do exist. So in making these suggestions, I'm not suggesting there aren't already teachers doing wonderful work and giving us wonderful examples of incorporating the arts and using the arts as a model for education. But my hope is that we can encourage more. That's the only time that happens. I couldn't make it stop. Okay, so if we flip, now it becomes a lens, this notion of the feeling and thinking dichotomy in the artistic process. What distinguishes the symbols involved in math or physics and the way in which we produce or perceive them? I don't remember anyone talking to me too much about the shape of symbols. I mean, geometry was fun. But how are those symbols like or different from the symbols involved in art? What does play look like in math or science or history or social studies? When we look at the accomplishments in those domains over time, how playful have folks been? What is a mathematical metaphor? Is intention fixed or changing in a scientific experiment? Fixed or changing in a work of art? How about the question of whether problem finding and solving is different in the arts than it is in whatever domain under consideration? How is it different? What can we learn from each domain to make the other better, or more interesting, or more engaging? What do we mean by a beautiful mathematical proof? Does it convey emotion? Does a mathematical proof ever make a mathematician weep? I bet. It would be fun to know. It would be interesting for a student to explore. What do you feel about your work? Why do we ask that of artists and we don't ask that of mathematicians? What conditions need to be in place for non-art subjects to invite the close interpretive attention associated with the aesthetic? I think Elliot Eisner now is working on some research looking at how we count the aesthetic in different domains and jobs and subjects. It should be very, very interesting. When the lenses are taken from the arts, they promise to muddy the scene in the important ways in which the arts make the familiar unfamiliar, the falsely simple richly true. And this is a painting done by the American painter Abbott Thayer. I don't know if you know, but he first recognized camouflage in nature and argued that because he was an artist and had studied in Europe with the Expressionists, he was particularly sensitive to light and color, and therefore discovered and brought to attention of scientists this notion of camouflage in nature. And he actually also had the idea that soldiers' uniforms would be safer if they were more like camouflage, and this is one of his drawings of an example. There's a great correspondence here in the Harvard libraries, or somewhere in the Harvard libraries, between him and Teddy Roosevelt, who thought that he had a sort of a good idea, and ultimately, obviously, but not in Thayer's lifetime, camouflage became very popular and used everywhere in army uniforms, but also made fun of the idea that he actually thought that even flamingos were camouflaged in some way. How ridiculous, a pink flamingo. But you take a look at a flamingo at the right time of day on the beach, right? Hard to see. What happens when we consider mainstream education in terms of the child as artist, romance, or reason? What questions might artful educators ask of themselves and students with an eye to this possible thriving tension, possibly thriving across disciplines? Is there a way in which the movers and shakers in whatever field you're talking about have similarities in approach to the discipline that are like children or like artists, and or are similarly considered outsiders to the mainstream? Think a little bit about scientific, technological geniuses. Do we have a similar stereotype to the artist on the outside? Be interesting to discuss with students. How do I, in my non-arts classes, encourage my students to feel freedom from the very rules and conventions that I am teaching them? Is there something about the natural freedom and connection and fluidity of the child artist that has bearing for the early understandings in my discipline? Where in what this discipline, so heavily associated with right and wrong answers, will I find a place for students to declare voice, their own personal style and expressivity? What happens when we regard whatever non-art subject we're talking about, like the arts, as an outsider to school? In what ways might it be edgy, controversial, heart of the matter, suspected, revered? Some folks think that youth are drawn to artists because they're outsiders, edgy, controversial, heart of the matter, revered. And that in a way, that is the way young people feel, children feel, arguably all of us. Don't the arts help us to see that difference is a given and sameness an illusion? How is that true, if at all, in the non-arts discipline that I am addressing? Artful teachers in any domain recognize and hope to cultivate rather than rewrite the experiences and abilities of their students. And last, and next to last, what happens when we consider mainstream education in terms of justification, celebration? I gave you a preview of this earlier. How, if at all, and if not, why not, has the non-arts subject justified itself throughout the history of education? What has caused it to change over time? And in what ways do its goals and its content change? How does its history relate to changing attitudes toward the field beyond school walls at a societal level? And what's its current relevance? When we actually celebrate that discipline, what are the unique opportunities that it offers? What would non-art subject-based versions of the 8 ways we began with look like? Science included, science-based. Applying an arts celebrative lens, what role do passion and industry, process and reflection, difference and respect, connection and community, what are the links? How many visiting mathematicians am I having in my class this year to make sure my students of math understand that this is a discipline in which folks are working with passion and industry beyond school walls? Why and how does art speak differently across place, time, subject, and circumstance? Last, what if we consider mainstream education in terms of the mighty muse and the safe haven? What sites exist outside of school in arenas for experiencing objects and achievements associated with whatever non-arts subject? Are there art museum approaches, some of the exciting inquiry-based tools that we use for looking at art in the museum that could be helpful in looking at the selected objects associated with your discipline? What is the relationship between inquiry and information in this field? What does it look like when whatever non-art subject it is approached as a means for achieving some of the goals of community art centers, from personal, interpersonal skills to cultural, intercultural, or even entrepreneurial? What does the sort of mentorship and student-focused approach of community art centers look like in the mainstream classroom? These are examples, hopefully, of the kinds of questions that educators may begin to consider, hopefully new considerations that may emerge for them as they begin to think of looking at their subject through the lens of the arts. And with deference to my generative tensions, what fills the space in between right and wrong in any subject? And is that blurry, edgy, questioning, provocative, and undetermined territory not where our interests lie? Oops. What if we consider general education as a work of art in progress? And this is a painting by Jack Levine. It's beautifully portrayed in a video by Sutherland called Feast of Reason. That's the name of the work. And loosely speaking, Jack Levine comes to his work of art in progress every day, and he begins by looking for what's wrong with it. He says, what's wrong is a place to begin. What's right, you have to work around. What if we looked at the importance of the student's ability to make sense of her own education, to put it all together like a work of art, bit by bit, as sometimes Surratt, another subject, is wont to say. Stacy Mahan, 04, I'm sure you recognize her stage set. It is the Elliott Lyman Room, completely cleaned out of furniture and chairs, and now a theater for a ballerina. How might such changes, Alisa, it's over, shift the posture of the discourse on arts and education from apology to applause? I'm very, very grateful to all of you, students in AIE, past, present, and future, artful educators, all of you, who will make better the place broader, the possibility for the arts in education. And although we're going to take questions now, a work of art by Scott Ruscher. He's not here, is he? But I'll show it to you. Oh, it's an octopus, Scott. If we don't have time to get to your questions today, if you read it and have some questions and you'd like to talk to me, here's my email address, and I'd love to keep the conversation going. So thank you very, very much. We have time for questions? Questions? Thank you. It was very close to what I said.
99% of the things you present to us are questions, so am I taking a leap of faith here to think that you think that you can't find the answers to most of the questions that you're asking?
Well, I would rather, first of all, what I said, although it's possible, it is possible that you are right in hearing me say that I think a question is a better organizing structure for knowledge than a set of answers. I did say that a real question is a question we don't know the answer to. And that's true of research and in art. For example, if I want to do a study as to whether my kids like to have cookies and fruit juice instead of math every Wednesday, I'm probably going to come out with some good results. It's not interesting to observe and say, well, how do I prove what I'm already seeing? What's more interesting is to find from your observations a question that you're really interested in. And this is the way you do a research study, right? I mean, that's the way you do a really good research study. And that's, I think, what art does, is ask us questions. I don't know if they have answers. Certainly they ask us a lot of questions that have answers. What year was I painted in? And other questions like that. But perhaps the most exciting ones for us are ones that we will now try to find out something we don't know through. Is that? Thank you. Yes?
Can you repeat again the name of the article and the author? He mentioned that the reason that museums have to revert to education is because
That was James Cuno, C-U-N-O. And it is the mission of the Academic Art Museum. Yeah, I think you'd probably find it in the AIE library. Anybody else? Thank you. Carol? What do I see as the future of arts educators in education? I am, of course, wondering, are you suggesting that a lot of this talks about general educators becoming more artful in their practice, and possibly, as we arts educators have often worried, making the art educator obsolete? My vision of the art educator in the future, if we attend more bravely and carefully to the arts, is that they become extraordinary resources, have very secure jobs in our schools, have classrooms, not carts, have opportunities to work with other teachers, where teachers actually come and study what they do for ideas for using the arts in their classroom, rather than asking the poor beleaguered arts teacher to come and study the history class to see how we could possibly use the arts. I see it becoming more essential and more revered. I see better pay. I see better vacations. It's hopeful feeling, but I do think that we have reached a point where we are in desperate need for the arts in our schools. We are in desperate need with this incredible insistence on quantitative measure to convince our children that they have something to say on which we cannot put a score, and that a score cannot tell us who they are, and that the arts are extraordinarily important vehicles for us learning about them. Yes, hello, Lida. Thank you.
Yeah, I was just fascinated by the anecdote about, was it Adam Thayer you said who discovered camouflage in nature?
Abbott Thayer. Abbott Henderson Thayer.
Oh, okay, thank you. It seems that it implicates so much in terms of seeing, knowing, thinking, and how you mentioned differences are a given, but the sameness is an illusion. So this is such a lens in how we see, feel, and learn.
Yes. I see it that way as well, and I appreciate and celebrate his pretty much telling us if he wasn't an artist, he wouldn't have been able to discover this scientific principle. It's pretty much the heart of the matter, isn't it? If we learn to attend as artists and to make sense of experience as artists, even if we're not, how much more we learn about whatever discipline we're engaged in. Thank you. Yes, Laura.
The concern of the arts in education seems to have been existing for a long time. What changes do you see taking place from 20 years ago to now in how the educating policymakers view the arts? 20 years ago, when I got my degree in music education, I was warned, hey, you're picking a pretty tough subject because you're going to start to see cuts. And yes, the cuts happen. However, there is arts education. There has been institutions that do bring the arts in the interdisciplinary subjects. And I just want to know, how do you see its role today compared to 20 years ago?
Okay. we can look at the city of New York, where the arts were pretty much eliminated 30 years ago. And what happened? Studio in a school, outside artist programs coming in, irreverent principals who said, not in my school. We saw the arts thriving, as they invariably do, regardless of whether they are being shut out. We have seen, actually that's been a very interesting thing in the last 20 years, the Lincoln Center, the notion of the visiting artist as an educational model. I can't say that charter schools for the arts are particularly new. There's certainly too few of them here in the Boston area, but there are some. And music and art in New York is forever. The Fame School is forever. There have always been outposts of folks working in the arts. But I do see a conscientious effort, certainly in this area, for us to have research and dissemination of information, this dreadful word replication of models that are working in the arts in different settings, often many of them outside of school walls, places like arts incentives. And the conversation is, there's lots of resources for a richer conversation. I must say, 20 years ago I sat in a forum of arts educators, and a woman from the Duke Ellington School said, in this arts-based school, kids who didn't used to come to school are coming every day. They are staying every day. They are talking about a future when they didn't used to talk about a future. But I cannot prove to anybody that their SAT scores have been improved by what's going on here in the arts. And I would say that there is still, when you go to arts conferences, a sense of we and them. We know about the intrinsic benefits, the life-saving features of arts education. They want numbers and figures. What I am trying to say in this book is if we who know about the arts don't stop worrying about what we think they want and start sharing aggressively what we know, the discourse will not change. Do not meet with other arts educators. Bring a principal to every one of those meetings. Get your word out to superintendents and stop having low expectations. They are human beings. They are educators. They are dedicated to children like we are. Let's start a conversation that's based on pride for what we have been doing for all of these years. I feel Steve getting nervous here. So I'm going to suggest that's our last question, and thank you once again for letting me talk. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Jessica. I said at the beginning that you had a kind of vision and nerve when you had the idea for the Arts and Education program. You've taken it from the Harvard Graduate School of Education to the rest of the world. So thank you very much.
Thank you. These guys all have nerve. They chose the AIE program instead of a regular one, right? Right on.
I want to remind everyone that there are copies of Jessica's book on sale in the hallway just outside this lecture hall.